Tonight, we're stepping back through time, not to the gilded halls of ancient empires or the stone temples of forgotten civilizations, but to something older, deeper, stranger. We're going to a world lit by fire and moonlight, where glaciers crept across continents and megafauna thundered through frozen valleys. We're going to meet our closest evolutionary cousins, the ones who walked this earth long before cities rose and fell, long before agriculture transformed the landscape. We're going to meet the Neanderthals. These weren't primitive brutes stumbling through caves with clubs, despite what a century of bad science fiction might suggest. They were humans, real humans with complex lives, sophisticated tools, and minds capable of abstract thought. They buried their dead with ceremony. They cared for the injured and elderly. They survived ice ages that would have crushed lesser species. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they vanished. But they didn't disappear completely. If you're watching this and your ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa, you carry fragments of them inside you right now, woven into the double helix of your DNA. 1 to 2% of your genome came from Neanderthals, passed down through countless generations, gifts from ancestors you'll never know, but who shaped who you are today. So if you will enjoy learning about them, you might want to like the video and subscribe for more. It really helps out. Now, back to their story. From the first bones discovered in a German valley to the cutting-edge genetic research revealing secrets that lay hidden for millennia. This is a story of evolution and extinction, of survival against impossible odds, and of the thin line that separated us from them. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's journey back to a world where two species of human walked the earth together, and where the outcome of that meeting changed everything. August 1856. The Neander Valley in Germany, 13 kilometers east of Düsseldorf. The valley had been mined for limestone for centuries, the stone pulled from the earth to build the growing industrial cities of Europe. Workers removing clay-like sediment from the Kleine Feldhofer Grotte uncovered something unusual at a depth of about 60 centimeters. Bones embedded in the cave fill. At first, they didn't even notice them. The bones were discarded among the mud and debris thrown down to scatter throughout the valley below. The cave sat 20 meters above the valley floor, and that fall likely destroyed pieces that might have completed the skeleton. But Wilhelm Becker-Schoff, one of the quarry owners, happened to be present when the bones were noticed. He thought they might belong to a cave bear, animals whose remains had turned up in other local caves before. Together with his co-owner Friedrich Wilhelm Pieper, Becker-Schoff retrieved what they could find, 16 bones and fragments pulled from the rubble. The bones eventually made their way to Johann Karl Fuhlrott, a local schoolteacher and fossil collector from Elberfeld. When Fuhlrott examined them, something clicked. The remains included a skull cap with a fragment of the left temporal bone, a fragment of the right scapula, a right clavicle, both humeri, the right one intact, a complete right radius, fragments of forearm bones, 5 ribs, almost a complete left half of the pelvis, and both femora. These weren't bare bones. They weren't even quite like modern human bones. The skull was long and low, with massive brow ridges that jutted forward like a shelf. The limb bones were thick, built for tremendous strength. Fuhlrott recognized immediately that he was holding something unprecedented. Without his consent, word of the discovery leaked to local newspapers. In early September 1856, A notice appeared in the Elberfeld newspaper and the Barmer local journal describing the surprising discovery in the Neander Valley. What should have been a careful scientific announcement became public sensation before proper study could begin. But 1856 was not a good time to claim you'd found evidence of ancient humans. Charles Darwin wouldn't publish On the Origin of Species for another 3 years. The scientific establishment still largely adhered to the biblical timeline of creation. The idea that humans might have primitive ancestors was heretical, dangerous, and to many, deeply offensive. Fuhlrott brought the bones to Hermann Schaffhausen, a respected anatomist who had already been questioning the immutability of species. Together, they examined the skeleton over the winter of 1856 to 1857, and in 1857 they published their findings. The remains, they argued, represented an ancient form of human, distinct from modern people, but undeniably human nonetheless. The reaction was swift and brutal. Rudolf Virchow, one of the most influential medical scientists of the era, dismissed the findings entirely. He insisted the bones belonged to a modern human who had suffered from disease, rickets perhaps, or other pathological conditions that had deformed the skeleton. Another scientist, August Franz Josef Karl Mayr, a staunch creationist, proposed an even more creative explanation. He claimed the skeleton belonged to a Cossack soldier who had roamed the area during the Napoleonic Wars, a mounted warrior whose lifestyle on horseback had shaped his bones, and whose permanently furrowed brow came from enduring chronic pain from a badly healed broken arm. A Cossack with rickets who happened to die in a cave 20 meters above the valley floor. The mental gymnastics required to accept this explanation were extraordinary, but for decades, many did. Fuhlrott's findings were blocked, ridiculed, dismissed. He died in 1877 without receiving recognition for what he'd discovered. But the bones didn't go away, and slowly, evidence mounted. In 1864, geologist William King proposed a formal name for the species, Homo neanderthalensis, named after the Neander Valley, where the first recognized specimen had been found. The valley itself had been named after Joachim Neander, a 17th century theologian and hymn writer who had loved walking through its beautiful limestone gorges. Neander meant new man in Greek. The irony was exquisite. The valley named for a new man would give its name to one of the oldest humans ever discovered. But even with a scientific name, acceptance came slowly. It wasn't until 1886, when 2 more Neanderthal skeletons were found at Spy in Belgium, that the pathology explanation finally crumbled. These weren't diseased modern humans. These were something else, something ancient, something that had walked the earth long before recorded history began. And then came the realization that Neanderthals hadn't been discovered in 1856 at all. Other fossils had been found earlier but not recognized for what they were. In 1829, Belgian prehistorian Philippe Charles Schmerling had discovered a skull, later called Engis II, in a cave in Belgium. He'd noted its strange features, but couldn't categorize it properly. In 1848, a skull found at Forbes Quarry in Gibraltar was presented to the Gibraltar Scientific Society, but was thought to be a modern human. Even the so-called Red Lady of Pavilan, discovered by William Buckland in Wales in 1823, was actually an early human fossil, though it took decades to realize it. By the early 20th century, as more fossils emerged from caves across Europe, the picture became clearer. Neanderthals had been a real, distinct population of humans who had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd inhabited a vast territory stretching from Portugal to Siberia, from northern Europe to the Middle East. They'd survived ice ages, they'd hunted mammoths, and then they'd vanished. The bones from that German quarry in 1856 became known as Neanderthal 1, or sometimes Veldhofer 1, after the cave where they'd been found. For decades, that cave's exact location was forgotten. The quarrying had destroyed it completely, and by 1900, no one could say precisely where the Kleine Veldhofer Grotte had stood. The landscape had been entirely transformed. Then, in 1997, two archaeologists, Ralf Schmitz and Jürgen Thyssen, did something remarkable. Using old quarry maps and geological surveys, they managed to pinpoint the exact location where the cave had been. They began excavating, digging through layers of rubble and blasting debris from 19th century mining operations, and they found more bones. 20 fragments that had been overlooked in 1856, including a molar, ribs, vertebrae, toe bones, and pieces of pelvis. One fragment, catalogued as NN13, fit perfectly onto the left lateral condyle of the femur, the left knee joint of the original Neanderthal 1 skeleton. After 140 years, missing pieces were finally coming home. In 2000, they continued excavating and recovered even more, including thousands of stone artifacts and animal bones. They found additional bone fragments, including pieces of skull that matched the original specimen exactly, proving beyond doubt that they'd found the right location. And most remarkably, they found bones from at least 3 separate individuals. The discovery of a third humerus, when only 2 had been known since 1856, revealed that Neanderthal 1 hadn't been alone in that cave. At least one other individual, more delicately built, had been there too. But the greatest gift from these new excavations wasn't more bones, it was DNA. Fresh from the ground, protected by cave sediments and the right chemical conditions, genetic material had survived. In 1997, mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthal 1 had been successfully sequenced for the first time, a groundbreaking achievement that opened entirely new avenues of research. The 2000 excavation provided even more samples, and by 2009, scientists had completed full sequences that allowed direct objective comparison between Neanderthals and modern humans at the genetic level. The discovery that had started with bones thrown carelessly down a quarry face had become one of the most studied, most analysed, most important archaeological finds in history. Neanderthal 1 became the type specimen for an entire species, the benchmark against which all other Neanderthal fossils would be measured. Every subsequent discovery, from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France to Shanidar in Iraq, would be compared to that original skeleton pulled from a German cave by workers who had no idea they were making history. Since then, thousands of Neanderthal fossils have been found, representing hundreds of individuals, including infants, children, adolescents, and adults. Sites have been discovered across Europe and Western Asia. Some, like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, contained multiple burials. Others, like the Cima de los Huesos in Spain, held the remains of at least 28 individuals in a single pit, dating back some 400,000 years, showing that Neanderthal characteristics had been developing for far longer than anyone initially suspected. Each new find added layers to our understanding. Each skeleton told a story of injury, disease, survival, adaptation. Together, they painted a picture not of a single moment frozen in time, but of a species that had lived, evolved, and thrived across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of miles. a species that had been, in almost every way that mattered, human. Origins: the long road to Neanderthal. Before there were Neanderthals, there were their ancestors. The story doesn't begin in Europe's frozen caves, but much earlier, in Africa, where all human lineages trace their roots. To understand Neanderthals, we have to step back even further, to a time when the human family tree was far more crowded than it is today. Around 600,000 to 800,000 years ago, Africa was home to early humans now classified as Homo heidelbergensis. The name comes from a jawbone, thick and chinless, found in 1907 near Heidelberg, Germany. German anthropologist Otto Schoedensack examined the mandible and recognized it as something distinct from both earlier and later humans. It was massive, heavily built, yet the teeth were surprisingly small. This wasn't Homo erectus, the earlier human ancestor with the sloping forehead and thick skull bones. This was something newer, something transitional. Homo heidelbergensis stood at a crossroads in human evolution. They had larger brains than Homo erectus, averaging around 1,250 cubic centimeters, approaching the size of modern human brains. They had more rounded skulls, though still with prominent brow ridges. They walked fully upright with long legs built for covering ground. And crucially, they controlled fire, built shelters, and created stone tools that required planning and foresight. The evidence suggests that around 600,000 to 700,000 years ago, a population of Homo heidelbergensis left Africa and migrated into Eurasia. Some moved into Europe, others spread across Asia. Those populations would become isolated from their African cousins, separated by geography, by climate, and by time. Evolution doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates slowly, generation after generation, as small changes in DNA get passed down, as natural selection favors certain traits, as populations adapt to their environments. The Heidelbergensis populations in Europe faced a radically different world than their African ancestors. Europe during the Middle Pleistocene was locked in a cycle of glacial and interglacial periods. Massive ice sheets advanced and retreated across the continent. Temperatures plummeted during glacial periods, transforming forests into tundra and grassland into frozen steppe. Then, during warmer interglacials, the ice would retreat and temperate woodlands would return. Living in these conditions required adaptations, both biological and cultural. The European Heidelbergensis populations began to change. Their bodies became more robust, better suited to conserve heat in cold climates. Their faces grew larger, with more prominent noses, possibly to warm and humidify cold air before it reached their lungs. Their bones thickened, and gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, a new form emerged. By around 400,000 to 430,000 years ago, fossils from sites like Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain show clear Neanderthal characteristics beginning to appear. These pre-Neanderthals, or early Neanderthals, had the telltale features that would define the species: the distinctive bun-shaped back of the skull, the large mid-facial projection, the robust build. They weren't fully Neanderthal yet, but they were on their way. The process is sometimes called Neanderthalization, the slow accumulation of traits that made Neanderthals distinct from other human populations. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual one, driven by a combination of natural selection, adapting them to cold climates and genetic drift, as populations expanded and contracted with the advance and retreat of ice sheets. Think of Europe during this time as a series of refugees. during severe glacial periods, ice covered much of the northern continent. Neanderthal populations would retreat to warmer southern regions, what are now Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, places where glaciers didn't reach. There, in isolated pockets, small populations would survive, and with small populations comes reduced genetic diversity. Traits could spread rapidly. Genetic drift, the random changes in gene frequency that happen by chance rather than selection, became a powerful force. Then, when the ice retreated and temperatures warmed during interglacial periods, these populations would expand northward again, recolonizing territories their ancestors had left. With each cycle, each advance and retreat, Neanderthal characteristics became more pronounced, more fixed in the population. The genetic evidence supports this picture. Studies of Neanderthal DNA show that the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans lived somewhere between 550,000 and 765,000 years ago, with most estimates clustering around 600,000 to 700,000 years ago. That ancestor was most likely Homo heidelbergensis, though some researchers argue for other candidates like Homo antecessor, known from fossils at Atapuerca in Spain. The split wasn't clean. Evolution rarely is. There may have been multiple migrations out of Africa, multiple waves of heidelbergensis populations moving into Eurasia. There may have been contact, even interbreeding, between these populations. The fossil record is fragmentary, full of gaps, and every new discovery seems to add complexity rather than clarity. What's clear is that by around 130,000 to 200,000 years ago, what are called classic Neanderthals had emerged. These were fully formed Neanderthals with all the characteristic features we recognize today. They dominated Europe and Western Asia during the last interglacial period and into the last ice age, and they would remain the dominant human population in these regions for over 100,000 years. Meanwhile, back in Africa, other descendants of Homo heidelbergensis were following their own evolutionary path. Around 300,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens, our species, emerged in Africa. Recent discoveries at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco have pushed this date even earlier, suggesting that modern human anatomy was developing across Africa over a long period, rather than appearing suddenly in one location. For hundreds of thousands of years, these two lineages, Neanderthals in Eurasia and early Homo sapiens in Africa, evolved separately. They faced different environments, different selective pressures, different challenges. Neanderthals adapted to the cold, to the boom and bust cycles of glacial Europe, to hunting large game across open steppes. Early modern humans adapted to the African savannas and woodlands, to different prey, different plants, different diseases. But evolution is not a tree with clean branches. It's more like a braided river with channels that split and merge, separate and reconnect. Around 250,000 years ago, genetic evidence suggests there may have been an early contact between populations. Some scientists believe a group of early modern humans or their close relatives migrated out of Africa and interbred with Neanderthals, leaving traces of modern human DNA in Neanderthal genomes. This is the controversial part, the part where the neat stories break down. The Middle Pleistocene, the period from about 770,000 to 126,000 years ago, has been called the muddle in the middle because of how complex and poorly understood it remains. Populations moved, they mixed, they split apart. The fossil record gives us snapshots, frozen moments, but the full motion picture remains frustratingly unclear. What matters is that by the time the last ice age began around 115,000 years ago, two distinct human species occupied different parts of the world. Neanderthals were firmly established across Europe and Western Asia, from the Atlantic coast to the Altai Mountains of Siberia, from Belgium in the north to Israel in the south. And in Africa, Homo sapiens were beginning their own expansion, developing new technologies, new social structures, and eventually new ambitions. The stage was set for one of the most important encounters in human history. Two species, two evolutionary experiments, both intelligent, both successful, both adapted to their worlds. When they finally met, when modern humans began migrating out of Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, the interaction would change both species forever. But before we get to that meeting, we need to understand who the Neanderthals really were. Not just where they came from, but what they looked like, how they lived, what made them uniquely suited to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. We need to meet them as they were, not as Victorian caricatures imagined them, but as the sophisticated, adapted, deeply human people they actually were. Physical form, built for ice and endurance. If you could step back 40,000 years and encounter a Neanderthal, the first thing that would strike you is how powerfully built they were. Not tall, necessarily. Most Neanderthals stood between 150 to 175 centimeters tall, roughly 5 feet to 5 feet 9 inches, with males averaging about 165 centimeters and females around 155 centimeters. That's somewhat shorter than average modern Europeans, but not dramatically so. What would catch your attention is how solid they were, how muscular, how dense. Neanderthals were stocky in a way that modern humans rarely are. Their bones were thicker than ours, heavier, built to support enormous muscle mass. Their shoulders were broad, their chest barrel-shaped and deep. Their limbs, particularly their lower legs and forearms, were proportionally shorter than modern humans. This wasn't random. This was adaptation, sculpted by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection in some of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth. There's a biological principle called Allen's rule that states that animals adapted to cold climates tend to have shorter limbs and appendages relative to their body size. This reduces surface area exposed to the cold, conserving precious body heat. Neanderthals followed this rule perfectly. Their compact, heavily muscled bodies with shortened extremities were essentially thermoregulatory machines, optimized to retain heat in environments where temperatures could plummet well below freezing for months at a time. Their weight matched their build. Studies estimating Neanderthal body mass from skeletal remains suggest males weighed around 78 kilograms, about 172 pounds, while females averaged about 66 kilograms, roughly 146 pounds. But this wasn't the soft weight of sedentary modern life. This was muscle, dense and powerful. In fact, when scientists calculated the body mass index for male Neanderthals, it came out to between 26.9 and 28.3, which in modern humans would be classified as overweight. But Neanderthals weren't carrying excess fat. They were simply built differently, with heavier bones and far more muscle mass than modern humans typically possess. Their skulls tell an equally distinctive story. Long and low rather than tall and rounded like ours, the Neanderthal skull is immediately recognizable. At the front, above the eye sockets, a prominent brow ridge jutted forward, creating a shelf of bone that modern humans lack. These aren't the single unibrow-style ridges you might imagine. They were actually rounded, following the curve of the eye socket, giving the face a distinctive topography. The back of the skull featured what's called an occipital bun, a rounded projection of bone that stuck out noticeably. No one's entirely certain why this feature evolved, though it may have been related to the attachment of powerful neck muscles or simply a consequence of how the skull grew. The face itself protruded more than modern human faces, creating what's called mid-facial prognathism. The nose was enormous by our standards, with a nasal aperture, the opening in the skull, much larger than modern humans. This wasn't about smell, interestingly. Studies of the olfactory bulbs in Neanderthal brains suggest their sense of smell may have actually been poorer than ours. Instead, that big nose was about warming and humidifying air. Imagine breathing in cold, dry Arctic air at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Without proper warming, that frigid air would damage delicate lung tissue. The Neanderthal nose, with its large internal chambers and extensive mucous membranes, acted like a biological humidifier and heater. By the time air traveled through those long nasal passages and reached the lungs, it would have been warmed and moistened, protecting vulnerable respiratory tissues. Recent studies using computational fluid dynamics, basically computer simulations of airflow, have shown that the Neanderthal nasal cavity was remarkably efficient at conditioning air. The internal surface area was substantial, giving cold air plenty of time and space to warm up before moving deeper into the body. Their cheekbones were strong and swept back, and beneath them were enlarged holes called infraorbital foramina. These openings allowed blood vessels to pass through, and in Neanderthals, they were notably larger than in modern humans. More blood flow to the face meant more warmth reaching the skin, helping prevent frostbite in exposed areas. The jaw was robust, powerfully built, without the pointed chin that modern humans have. Neanderthal teeth were large and showed distinctive wear patterns, particularly on the front incisors. The wear was so consistent and so severe that scientists believe Neanderthals regularly used their teeth as tools, essentially a third hand for gripping materials while working. Think of it as built-in vice grips. Inside the skull, the brain was actually larger on average than modern human brains. Neanderthal brain volumes averaged about 1,740 cubic centimeters for males and 1,460 cubic centimeters for females, compared to modern human averages of about 1,350 cubic centimeters. But size isn't everything. The shape was different. Neanderthal brains were longer and lower, matching the skull shape, while modern human brains are taller and more globular. This difference in shape may have meant differences in brain organization, particularly in areas related to social cognition and language, though the exact implications remain hotly debated. Moving down the skeleton, the rib cage was distinctive. Where modern humans have a relatively narrow cylindrical chest, Neanderthals had a barrel chest that flared out from the spine. This gave them greater lung capacity, useful for processing oxygen in cold air and supporting the high metabolic demands of their muscular bodies. It also provided more room for a larger, more powerful heart to pump blood through that dense muscle tissue. Their spine and pelvis were structured differently too. The vertebrae were thick, the pelvis broad and robust. The hip joints were positioned in a way that some researchers believe gave Neanderthals a slightly different gait than modern humans, though they walked fully upright, without any of the stooped posture that early 20th century reconstructions imagined. The limb bones, the femur, tibia, humerus, and radius were notably thick-walled and often showed prominent muscle attachment sites. The ridges and bumps on bones where powerful muscles connected. Their hands were large, with thick fingers and strong grips. They could have wielded tools with precision, but also applied tremendous force when needed. One particularly interesting feature is the asymmetry often found in Neanderthal skeletons. The right arm bones are frequently more robust than the left, suggesting they were predominantly right-handed and that they regularly performed activities requiring enormous arm strength. Some researchers believe this came from thrusting spears, holding the weapon tight while driving it into large, dangerous prey at close range. And speaking of danger, Neanderthal skeletons show an extraordinary rate of traumatic injury. Studies estimate that 79 to 94% of Neanderthal fossils show evidence of healed major trauma. Broken bones, crush injuries, wounds that would have been agonizingly painful. The pattern of injuries is remarkably similar to what modern rodeo riders experience when regularly interacting with large, dangerous animals like bulls. This suggests Neanderthals hunted in close quarters, getting near enough to mammoths, woolly rhinos and cave bears to be seriously injured, but also to make kills. Yet here's the remarkable part. Many of these injuries had healed. Broken limbs had knitted back together. Wounds had closed. This tells us that injured Neanderthals received care, that their community supported them during recovery, that they survived traumas that should have been fatal. One famous example is Shanidar I, a Neanderthal from Iraq, who survived to middle age despite catastrophic injuries. He had a crushing blow to the head that damaged his eye socket and likely left him partially blind. His right arm was withered, probably from nerve damage, and yet he lived for years after these injuries, reaching 35 to 45 years old. Someone had to help him, had to care for him, had to value his life enough to keep him fed and protected when he could no longer hunt. The skin color of Neanderthals varied, just like modern humans. Genetic studies of the MC1R gene, which influences pigmentation, suggest they had a range of skin tones from pale to darker. Hair color also varied, with evidence for dark, brown, and possibly even red hair, though red appears to have been uncommon. They were adapted to different environments across their range, and those adaptations included pigmentation suited to local light levels and UV exposure. What emerges from all this evidence is a picture of a human species exquisitely adapted to harsh conditions. The cold-adapted body, the powerful build, the high metabolic rate, all of it makes sense for populations living at the edge of glaciers, enduring winters that could last 6 months or more, hunting animals that could easily kill them if a spear thrust went wrong. But these same adaptations came with costs. That muscular body required enormous amounts of calories to maintain. Estimates suggest Neanderthals needed anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 calories per day, depending on activity levels and temperature. For context, a modern sedentary adult might need 2,000 to 2,500 calories. Neanderthals were burning fuel at a much higher rate, and in Ice Age Europe, calories weren't always easy to come by. Their stocky build, perfect for cold climates, would have been less advantageous in temperate or warm environments. They weren't built for endurance running in the way modern humans are, with our long legs and efficient cooling systems. Neanderthals were sprinters, powerhouses built for short bursts of incredible strength, not for running down prey across miles of open savanna. and their large heads and robust skeletons meant Neanderthal mothers faced difficult childbirths. The pelvic canal was wide, yes, but giving birth to a baby with a large head and thick bones was still dangerous. We know from skeletal evidence that some Neanderthal women died in childbirth or shortly after. A reminder that even with their adaptations, life remained precarious. They were human, distinctly so, but shaped by their world in ways modern humans rarely are. Every aspect of their anatomy, from the shape of their skulls to the thickness of their thigh bones, tells the story of survival in Europe's frozen heart, of endurance in the face of impossible odds, of a species that refused to give up even when the glaciers advanced and the forests retreated and the world grew dark and cold for months on end. This was the Neanderthal body, the biological foundation upon which everything else, their culture, their tools, their social lives, was built. And understanding that foundation helps us understand not just how they lived, but why they lived the way they did. The Neanderthal range was vast, stretching across what anthropologists call Western Eurasia. At their peak, Neanderthals inhabited territories from the Atlantic coast of Portugal in the west, all the way to the Altai Mountains of Siberia in the east, a span of thousands of miles. In the north, their territory reached into what's now Belgium and Germany, pushing up against the advancing ice sheets during glacial periods. In the south, they lived in the Mediterranean regions of Spain, Italy, and Greece, and extended into the Middle East, with significant populations in what are now Israel, Iraq, and Syria. This wasn't a continuous, evenly populated empire. Instead, think of it as a patchwork of territories occupied and abandoned as climate shifted. During warm interglacial periods, Neanderthals would expand northward, following the migration of game animals and the spread of forests and grasslands. When glaciers advanced during cold periods, populations would contract, retreating to southern refuges in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans, places where ice never reached and where survival remained possible. The time span is equally impressive. The earliest fossils showing clear Neanderthal characteristics, those from Cima de los Huesos in Spain, date back roughly 430,000 years. That means Neanderthal features had been evolving for nearly 500,000 years. Classic Neanderthals, the fully formed version of the species we're most familiar with, existed from about 130,000 to 200,000 years ago through to their extinction around 40,000 years ago. Think about that timeline, 400,000 years. For context, modern humans in our current form have only existed for about 300,000 years, and our recorded history covers maybe the last 5,000 years. Neanderthals survived through multiple ice ages, dozens of glacial and interglacial cycles, climate shifts that would have devastated less adaptable species. The environments they inhabited varied dramatically depending on time and place. In the coldest periods, places like northern France and southern England resembled Arctic tundra, with permanently frozen ground, sparse vegetation, and temperatures that could drop to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius in winter. Imagine living there with Stone Age technology. Imagine keeping your children alive through 6 months of near total darkness and killing cold. Yet they did. Archaeological sites from these periods show Neanderthals not just surviving but thriving, hunting reindeer and woolly mammoths, building shelters, maintaining fires. They weren't just enduring the cold, they were mastering it. In warmer periods or southern regions, the landscape transformed. Temperate woodlands of oak and beech covered the hills. Rivers ran full with fish. Wild boar, red deer, and aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, roamed through forest clearings. The climate wasn't tropical, but it was livable without the desperate struggle against cold that characterized the glacial periods. Coastal regions held special importance. Sites like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar show evidence of Neanderthal occupation spanning tens of thousands of years. The Mediterranean coast offered milder climates, access to marine resources like shellfish and seals, and refuge during the worst climate swings. Some researchers believe these coastal refugees may have been where the last Neanderthals survived, holding on in small populations long after they'd vanished elsewhere. The archaeological record reveals fascinating patterns of mobility. Neanderthals weren't sedentary. They moved with the seasons, following game herds, tracking the ripening of plant resources, seeking shelter when weather turned harsh. Some sites show evidence of seasonal occupation, used repeatedly over thousands of years as part of a regular circuit. Other sites appear to be temporary camps, occupied for days or weeks before the group moved on. Raw materials for tools tell us even more. Stone tools found at Neanderthal sites often come from sources dozens of kilometers away, sometimes over 100 kilometers distant. This means Neanderthals either traveled extensively to collect good stone, or, perhaps more intriguingly, had exchange networks where materials were passed between groups. Either way, they had knowledge of their landscape that extended far beyond immediate hunting territories. Cave systems were crucial to Neanderthal life, not because they were cavemen in the stereotypical sense, but because caves provided natural shelter. A good cave offered protection from wind, insulation from temperature extremes, and defensible space against predators. Sites like La Ferraci in France, Kbara in Israel, and Krapina in Croatia show repeated occupation over thousands of years. These weren't just crash pads. These were homes, places where families gathered, where children were born, where the dead were buried with care. But Neanderthals also lived in open-air settings. In Ukraine, evidence suggests they built structures using mammoth bones, massive skulls, and long bones arranged as framework, probably covered with hides. These structures weren't simple. One site contained 25 hearths, indicating substantial organized habitation. Population density was another key factor. Neanderthals lived in small groups, probably extended family bands of 10 to 30 individuals. The total Neanderthal population at any given time was likely quite small compared to modern human populations, perhaps numbering in the tens of thousands across their entire range. This low population density, combined with geographic fragmentation during glacial periods, meant many Neanderthal groups lived in relative isolation. Gene flow between distant populations would have been limited, leading to regional differences and, unfortunately, increased risks of inbreeding when populations crashed during climate swings. Genetic studies support this picture of a sparse, fragmented population. Neanderthal DNA shows signs of low genetic diversity, consistent with small population sizes and occasional bottlenecks when numbers drop dramatically. This would have made them vulnerable to random events, disease outbreaks, or sudden climate shifts. A species numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions can absorb losses. A species numbering in the tens of thousands cannot. Still, for hundreds of thousands of years, the system worked. Neanderthals persisted, adapted, survived. They weathered ice ages that buried half of Europe under kilometers of ice. They hunted animals that could, and often did, kill them. They raised children in environments that would challenge modern humans armed with Gore-Tex and synthetic insulation. They were, in their domain, supremely successful. The end of their time, when it came, was sudden. By 40,000 years ago, all traces of Neanderthals vanish from the archaeological record. The last dated sites are in southern Spain, Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, and a few locations in southern France and Croatia. After dominating Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, they were gone, leaving behind only bones, tools, and the mysterious traces in our DNA that prove they didn't disappear completely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand their ending, we need to understand their living, their daily existence, the tools they made, the food they ate, the lives they led. We need to walk with them through their world, as close as evidence and imagination can take us. Daily life, survival on the edge morning in Ice Age Europe. The sun rises late, struggling over the horizon after long, dark hours. In a cave mouth halfway up a limestone cliff, a fire burns. Smoke drifts out into the cold air, grey against a greyer sky. Around the fire, a group stirs. Neanderthals, maybe a dozen of them, preparing for another day of survival. This is not speculation. This is reconstruction based on thousands of hours of archaeological work, analysis of bone chemistry, examination of tool marks, study of fire pits and food debris. We can't know everything, but we know more than you might think. Neanderthals were hunters, primarily and necessarily. Their bodies required massive caloric intake, and in Ice Age Europe, especially during cold periods, plant foods were scarce or unavailable for much of the year. Meat was the primary fuel that kept them alive. Chemical analysis of Neanderthal bones, specifically looking at isotope ratios of nitrogen and carbon, tells us what they ate. The results are unambiguous. Neanderthals consumed a lot of meat, levels comparable to apex carnivores like wolves. Their prey were the megafauna of the Pleistocene, woolly mammoths with their massive size and thick fur, woolly rhinoceroses, equally enormous and armed with dangerous horns, cave bears that outweighed modern grizzlies, aurochs, wild cattle standing 2 meters tall at the shoulder, red deer, reindeer, wild horses, and bison. These weren't gentle creatures. They were large, powerful, and perfectly capable of killing a human with a kick, a charge, or a swipe of a tusk. Hunting them required courage, skill, and cooperation. Neanderthals used thrusting spears, heavy wooden shafts tipped with carefully shaped stone points. These weren't throwing spears designed for distance, but close combat weapons meant to be driven into prey at arm's length. The asymmetry in Neanderthal arm bones, that overdeveloped right arm, came from repeatedly thrusting these spears with enormous force, holding them steady as they punched through thick hide into vital organs. This style of hunting was dangerous, as the high rate of traumatic injuries in Neanderthal skeletons makes clear. Imagine facing down a woolly rhinoceros with a wooden spear. You have one chance. If you miss the vital spot, if the spear doesn't penetrate deep enough, that animal is coming for you, and it's a 5-ton wall of muscle and fury. One blow could shatter bones. One misstep could mean death. But Neanderthals didn't hunt alone. Evidence suggests they hunted in coordinated groups, probably using tactics like ambush or driving prey toward waiting hunters. Some sites show mass kills, places where dozens of animals were slaughtered at once, likely driven into natural traps like box canyons or steep slopes. This level of coordination required communication, planning, and trust. they didn't just hunt large game. Analysis of food residues and microwear on teeth shows Neanderthals also consume plant foods when available. Seeds, nuts, roots, mushrooms, berries, anything edible. At coastal sites like Gorham's Cave, they exploited marine resources. Shellfish shells litter the cave floors. Evidence suggests they caught fish, hunted seals, maybe even dolphins. They weren't picky, they were practical. Whatever calories were available, they took them. Survival didn't allow for culinary snobbery. Fire was central to Neanderthal life, absolutely fundamental. Evidence for controlled fire use goes back at least 400,000 years in sites associated with Neanderthal ancestors. By the time classic Neanderthals appeared, fire mastery was routine. Every major Neanderthal site contains hearths, carefully constructed fire pits, often in the same locations across multiple occupations. Fire provided warmth, obviously critical in Ice Age climates. It also offered light, extending the useful hours of day into darkness. But perhaps most importantly, fire transformed food. Cooking meat makes it easier to digest, kills parasites, and breaks down tough fibers. For Neanderthals eating large quantities of meat, cooking was more than convenience. It was efficiency, a way to extract maximum calories from every kill. Fire also served social functions. The hearth was the center of camp, the place where the group gathered. Around the fire, tools were made, skins were worked, meat was cooked and shared. Stories might have been told. Children watched their elders work, learning techniques through observation and practice. The fire was light and warmth, but it was also the heart of community. Shelter varied with location and season. Caves, when available, were preferred. But caves weren't common everywhere, and some caves were occupied by dangerous predators like cave lions and hyenas. Neanderthals had to compete for these spaces, and the archaeological record shows they sometimes shared cave systems with carnivores, probably using fire to keep predators at bay. When caves weren't available, Neanderthals built shelters. The evidence is scarce because organic materials like wood and hide don't preserve well, but sites like Moldova in Ukraine show structures made from mammoth bones. These weren't trivial constructions. Arranging mammoth skulls and long bones to create structural frameworks would have required effort, planning, and engineering intuition. The structures were likely covered with animal hides, creating wind-resistant shelters heated by interior fires. Clothing was essential, though direct evidence is limited. No Neanderthal clothing has survived, but we know they had the tools to make it. Stone scrapers found at Neanderthal sites show distinctive wear patterns consistent with hide processing. They would have scraped fat and tissue from animal skins, then worked the hides to make them supple. Sinew from animals could serve as thread for stitching, though whether Neanderthals used needles or simpler techniques remains debated. Given the extreme cold they faced, it's almost certain Neanderthals wore clothing, probably simple cloaks or wraps made from animal hides. Fur side in for insulation. Some researchers suggest they may have worn footwear, crude moccasins or foot wrappings to protect against frozen ground. Without such protection, surviving winter would have been nearly impossible. Water was available from rivers and springs, though in winter, procuring it might have required breaking ice. Food storage was limited. Without pottery or advanced food preservation techniques, meat had to be consumed relatively quickly, or at least within days, if ambient temperatures were cold enough to prevent spoilage. During warmer months, spoilage would have been a constant concern. Social structure, as best we can reconstruct it, centered on small family groups. Evidence from sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq suggests multi-generational groups lived together. Children, adults, and elderly individuals all appear in the same context. The care given to injured and elderly individuals, like Shanidar I with his severe disabilities, suggests strong social bonds and a culture that valued members beyond their immediate productive capacity. Sex-based division of labor is harder to determine. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, hunting is often, but not exclusively, male-dominated, while plant gathering involves both sexes. Neanderthals likely had similar patterns, though their heavy reliance on hunting might have meant both men and women participated in hunts, particularly in drives or ambushes where numbers mattered more than individual strength. Children learn by doing. Neanderthal sites contain poorly made tools, practice pieces created by learners. Young Neanderthals would have watched their parents and other adults, then tried to replicate techniques with stone, wood, and hide. Mistakes were learning opportunities. The skills required to survive, tool making, hunting, fire starting, hide processing, were passed down generation to generation through patient instruction and hands-on practice. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Few Neanderthals lived past 40. Infant and childhood mortality was probably high. Women faced risks during childbirth. Men and women both face risks from hunting injuries, infections, and simple accidents. A broken leg, a deep puncture wound, a bad fall. Any of these could be fatal without modern medical care. Yet they persisted. Each generation raised the next. Each band maintained its territory, its knowledge, its traditions. The daily grind of survival, gathering firewood, napping tools, hunting prey, processing hides, minding children, repeating the cycle day after day, season after season, was how Neanderthals endured, not through grand gestures or dramatic innovations, but through stubborn, patient, relentless survival. The hands that shaped stone. Neanderthal technology. If you wanted to understand Neanderthals, you could do worse than starting with their tools. Stone artifacts don't lie. They preserve for hundreds of thousands of years, and they tell clear stories about the minds that made them. The technology most associated with Neanderthals is called the Mousterian industry, named after the Le Moustier rock shelter in France where these tools were first systematically studied. The Mousterian lasted from roughly 300,000 to 40,000 years ago, encompassing the entire classic Neanderthal period. What made Mousterian technology distinctive was its sophistication. Unlike earlier tool traditions that worked a single stone down into a desired form, Mousterian knappers used a technique called levallois, or prepared core technology. Here's how it worked. A toolmaker would select a suitable piece of flint or similar stone. Good flint was essential because it fractures predictably, creating sharp edges. With careful percussion using a hammerstone, the toolmaker would shape the core, creating a domed surface with carefully prepared striking platforms. This wasn't random bashing. This required understanding the three-dimensional geometry of stone, visualizing how force applied at specific angles would cause flakes to detach. Once the core was prepared, a single precise blow at the platform would detach a large flake, already shaped roughly into a useful form. This flake, called a levallois flake, could then be further refined through careful retouching to create specialized tools. The brilliance of this method was efficiency. From a single prepared core, a skilled napper could produce multiple predetermined flakes, each suitable for different tasks. It was standardized production, Stone Age manufacturing. The tools themselves came in dozens of varieties: side scrapers for processing hides, cleaning skins, and working leather. Points, triangular and symmetrical, probably hafted onto wooden shafts to create spear tips. Denticulates, tools with notched edges like saw teeth, possibly used for shaping wood or working bone. Backed knives with one edge dulled for safe hand-holding and the opposite edge sharp for cutting. Studies of edge wear and residues show these tools had specific purposes. Scrapers show polish consistent with working hides. Points show damage patterns from impact, proving they functioned as weapons. Some tools show traces of wood wear, evidence that Neanderthals shaped wooden implements, even though wood rarely preserves. But mastery in technology wasn't uniform. Different Neanderthal groups made different toolkits. Some assemblages are dominated by scrapers, others by points, still others by denticulates. For decades, archaeologists debated whether this meant different Neanderthal groups had different cultural traditions, or whether the same people made different tools for different tasks depending on what they were doing at a particular site. The answer is probably both. Regional traditions existed, different groups, slightly different approaches, but functional variability also mattered. A hunting camp would have different tool needs than a hide processing site. Around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, a new technology appeared at some Neanderthal sites called the Chattelperonian. This was more advanced than classic Mousterian, featuring well-struck blades, the long, slender flakes that characterize Upper Paleolithic technology. Some Chattelperonian sites also contain bone tools and personal ornaments, items made from shells or animal teeth that serve no practical purpose beyond decoration or symbolic meaning. For years, archaeologists assumed these advanced tools must have been made by early modern humans, that Neanderthals couldn't have developed such sophisticated technology on their own. But then a Neanderthal skeleton, the Saint-Césaire individual, was discovered in association with Chattelperonian tools. This proved Neanderthals created this technology. The debate then shifted. Did Neanderthals invent the Chattelperonian independently, or did they copy it from modern humans who were beginning to enter Europe? Did cultural exchange occur between the two species? The answer remains uncertain, though the timing suggests contact was likely. Modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, and the Chattelperonian appears shortly after. Coincidence or cultural transmission? We don't know. What's clear is that Neanderthals were capable of learning, of adopting new techniques, of innovation. They weren't stuck in unchanging traditions. Their technology evolved, slowly compared to modern humans, but still perceptibly. Beyond stone, Neanderthals worked other materials. Wooden spears, some found preserved in bogs, show careful shaping and fire hardening of tips. Fire hardening involves slowly charring wood to make it harder and more durable without burning it completely, a technique requiring patience and skill. They worked bone, though less extensively than modern humans. A few bone tools have been found at Neanderthal sites, but bone working never became a major industry for them the way it did for Upper Paleolithic humans. They used plant materials, though evidence is sparse because plants decay. Twisted plant fibers could create cordage for binding tools to handles. Resins from trees could serve as adhesives for hafting stone points onto wooden shafts. Analysis of residues on some Neanderthal tools shows complex adhesives made from birch bark tar, which requires heating birch bark to specific temperatures in low oxygen conditions, a sophisticated pyrotechnology. Toolmaking wasn't just practical, it was social and educational. Learning to knap flint takes years of practice. A skilled knapper can visualize the stone, predict how it will fracture, control force precisely. Teaching this skill required patience, demonstration, correction of mistakes. Archaeological sites contain tool-making debris, the waste flakes and broken pieces that pile up during knapping. Among these remains are awkward pieces, practice attempts by learners. This tells us Neanderthals taught their children that knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship and observation. Tools were also mobile. Neanderthals carried them as they moved, curated favored pieces, maintained and resharpened them. Some tools show repeated resharpening, reduced down to tiny remnants before being discarded. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of good stone was precious, especially in regions where flint wasn't readily available. The level of planning required for Neanderthal life was substantial. Making a spear required not just shaping the wooden shaft, but also creating a stone point, preparing adhesive, and hafting everything together securely. Preparing for a hunt meant ensuring everyone had weapons, that fire-starting materials were available, that the group understood the plan. Processing a kill required coordinated butchery, transport of meat back to camp, distribution among the group. This was cognitive complexity in action, not the thoughtless behavior of instinct-driven animals, but the considered choices of intelligent beings solving problems, planning ahead, and teaching the next generation how to survive. Their tools, those shaped pieces of stone scattered across Europe, are the fingerprints of Neanderthal minds, proof of thought, intention, and skill that deserves our respect. One of the most profound questions about Neanderthals is also one of the hardest to answer. Did they speak? And if so, what did their language sound like? The physical evidence gives us tantalizing clues. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx, has been found in Neanderthal remains, most notably from Kabara Cave in Israel. This hyoid is virtually identical to the modern human hyoid, suggesting the vocal anatomy necessary for speech was present. The base of the Neanderthal skull shows the hypoglossal canal, the opening through which the nerve that controls tongue movement passes. This canal is large in Neanderthals, similar to modern humans, suggesting fine motor control of the tongue, essential for producing the complex sounds of spoken language. Perhaps most compellingly, genetic analysis has revealed that Neanderthals possess the same version of the FOXP2 gene as modern humans. This gene plays a crucial role in language ability. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech and language deficits in modern humans. The fact that Neanderthals had the modern human version suggests they had, at minimum, the biological capacity for complex vocal communication. But having the anatomy for speech doesn't prove language existed in the form we know it. Birds have complex vocal anatomy and produce intricate songs, but that's not language in the human sense. The question is whether Neanderthals had symbolic thought, grammatical rules, the ability to discuss things not immediately present, past, events, future plans, abstract concepts. The behavioral evidence offers strong hints. Neanderthals made complex tools that required multi-step planning, each stage building toward a final product. They hunted cooperatively, which demands coordination and shared understanding of roles and tactics that would be difficult to achieve through gesture alone. They cared for injured and disabled group members over extended periods, suggesting social bonds that could benefit from the ability to communicate about needs, intentions, and emotions. They buried their dead, which implies concepts of identity, loss, and perhaps beliefs about what happens after death. Teaching tool making, a behavior clearly documented at Neanderthal sites through the presence of poorly executed practice pieces, would be enormously difficult without language. Try imagining teaching someone to knap flint using only gestures. It's possible, but painfully slow and inefficient. With language, you can explain angles, forces, the properties of different stones, strategies for dealing with difficult pieces. Language makes complex knowledge transfer vastly more efficient. Based on this convergence of anatomical and behavioral evidence, most researchers now believe Neanderthals had language, though it may not have been as complex or flexible as modern human language. Their syntax might have been simpler, their vocabulary more limited, their ability to discuss abstract concepts less developed, but they could communicate, coordinate, teach, and share information in ways that go far beyond simple gestures or animal calls. What did they think about? What occupied Neanderthal minds beyond immediate survival needs? We can't know for certain, and any answer requires careful interpretation of limited evidence. But we do know they noticed unusual objects. At several Neanderthal sites, collections have been found that seem to serve no practical purpose. Crystals of quartz, translucent and geometric. Fossils of ancient seashells, picked up and carried far from their original locations. Chunks of colourful minerals like iron oxide and manganese dioxide. These items had no obvious utility for hunting, hide working, or other survival tasks. The most reasonable interpretation is that they were collected because they were interesting, perhaps beautiful, perhaps meaningful in ways we can't reconstruct. Pigments especially fascinate researchers. Over 70 Neanderthal sites contain evidence of pigment use, primarily red and black. Red ochre, an iron oxide that produces vivid red and orange tones, and black manganese oxide were both collected, ground into powder, and apparently used for something. What exactly remains debated and uncertain. One possibility is body painting. Many modern human cultures use pigments for body decoration, creating patterns that signal identity, status, or ritual participation. Neanderthals might have done the same, though we have no direct evidence of painted bodies. Another possibility is hide treatment, as some pigments can help preserve leather or make it more supple. But the sheer abundance of pigment at some sites, where over 500 black pigment fragments have been found in a single location, suggests use beyond mere practical applications. The quantities recovered hint at something more, though what that more might be remains open to interpretation. Some pigment-stained shells found at Neanderthal sites in Spain appear to have been deliberately pierced and strung, creating simple jewelry. These aren't elaborate ornaments, but they represent intentional creation of items meant to be worn, to be seen, to adorn the body. That symbolic behavior, the use of objects to convey meaning or identity. Personal ornaments raise profound questions. Why would Neanderthals care about appearance? If they made and wore jewelry, what were they communicating? Status within a group? Group membership or affiliation? Individual identity? We do the same today, choosing clothes and accessories that signal who we are and which groups we belong to. If Neanderthals engaged in similar behavior, it would suggest self-awareness, social complexity, and symbolic thought. But we must be cautious. The evidence for Neanderthal ornaments is limited and sometimes controversial, with only a handful of clear examples. Music is another tantalizing possibility. A bone artifact from Divya Babe in Slovenia has been interpreted by some researchers as a flute. A cave bear femur with holes that could have been deliberately made to produce musical notes. If genuine, it would represent the oldest musical instrument ever discovered. However, this interpretation remains highly controversial. Other researchers argue the holes were created by carnivore teeth, puncturing the bone during feeding, a natural process that can create patterns remarkably similar to deliberately crafted instruments. The debate remains unresolved, with passionate advocates on both sides. The possibility that Neanderthals created music, that they made sound for pleasure or ritual rather than mere communication, is deeply appealing, but unproven. Cave art is largely absent from Neanderthal sites, which is one of the stark differences between them and Upper Paleolithic modern humans who covered cave walls with paintings of animals, handprints, and abstract symbols. However, some controversial evidence exists. At La Roche-Cotard Cave in France, engravings in soft limestone have been dated by some researchers to around 57,000 years ago, well within the Neanderthal period, and before modern humans arrived in the region. These aren't sophisticated cave paintings, but simple finger-drawn lines and shapes. The dating and interpretation remain debated, but if accepted, they could represent the oldest known engravings created by any human species. What's frustratingly absent is clear evidence of Neanderthal belief systems. Did they have myths? Did they tell stories? Did they attribute meaning to natural phenomena, seeing spirits in storms or agency in the movements of animals? We can speculate, but we can't know. The archaeological record preserves actions, not thoughts, objects, not beliefs. One behavior that does survive in the archaeological record, though, is burial. The dead and the living. Neanderthal burials. Multiple. Neanderthal sites contain evidence of intentional burials, not accidental deaths where bodies were left where they fell, but deliberate interments where individuals were placed in prepared graves. At La Ferracie in France, several Neanderthal burials were found, including adults and children, some positioned carefully in shallow pits. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints, an elderly male Neanderthal was placed in a deliberately excavated grave. At Kabara Cave in Israel, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found in what appears to be a carefully prepared burial context. Shanidar Cave in Iraq contained multiple burials, some controversial, some more certain. The evidence for intentional burial includes several factors. First, the preservation of relatively complete skeletons, which is rare unless the body was protected soon after death. Second, the positioning of bodies, often in flex positions that would be difficult to achieve naturally. Third, the presence of grave features like shallow pits or stone arrangements around the body. And fourth, in a few cases, possible grave goods. Though this is where things get extremely controversial. The most famous example is Shanidar 4, a Neanderthal burial where soil samples taken in the 1960s contained large amounts of flower pollen. The original excavator, Ralph Solecki, and paleobotanist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan interpreted this as evidence that the body had been covered with flowers, including yarrow, cornflower, bachelor's button, and hollyhock. The pollen was found in concentrated clusters, and many of the plants identified had medicinal properties. The flower burial became iconic, presented as proof that Neanderthals felt compassion and appreciated beauty. Unfortunately, the interpretation has been seriously challenged by subsequent research. In 1999, archaeologist Jeffrey Summer pointed out that rodent burrows had been found near the burial, and that Meriones persicus, a gerbil-like rodent native to the Shanidar region, is known to store large quantities of flower heads in its burrows, along with seeds and other plant material. The amount of flower material this species caches could easily account for the pollen concentrations found at the site. Other researchers have suggested solitary bees nesting in the cave might have deposited the pollen clumps, or that contamination from the excavation team themselves, some of whom wore flowers in their belts, could have introduced pollen. By the early 2000s, most researchers had concluded, as archaeologist Paul Pettit stated, that the deliberate placement of flowers has now been convincingly eliminated. Even without flower burials, the simple act of burying the dead is significant. It requires time and effort. In the harsh world of Ice Age Europe, time and effort weren't spent casually. Digging a grave, even a shallow one, means someone cared enough about the deceased to ensure their body was treated differently than mere refuse. Why bury the dead? Practical explanations exist. Burial prevents scavengers from disturbing the remains and possibly attracting dangerous predators to the living area. It removes the smell of decomposition from the immediate vicinity. These are sensible reasons that don't require assuming complex beliefs. But humans rarely do things for only practical reasons. Modern hunter-gatherers who practice burial often do so because they believe something about the dead, that they require proper treatment to rest peacefully, that they continue to exist in some form, that social bonds persist beyond death. If Neanderthals believe something similar, burial becomes evidence of concepts about death, identity, and possibly afterlife. We can't prove Neanderthals believed in an afterlife. We can only note that they treated their dead differently than they treated game animals or refuse, and that this treatment required deliberate action. That's as close as the evidence takes us, but it suggests something beyond purely practical behavior. One detail worth mentioning: Neanderthal burials don't contain elaborate grave goods. A few sites have stones or animal bones near bodies, but nothing like the rich assemblages found in Upper Paleolithic modern human burials with their carved figurines, shell beads, and ochre-stained bones. If Neanderthals had beliefs about provisioning the dead for a journey to another world, those beliefs didn't involve material wealth. Or perhaps their rituals used perishable materials like flowers, furs, or food that left no archaeological trace. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but it does suggest Neanderthal symbolic behavior was less elaborate, or at least less materially expressed, than what we see in contemporary modern humans. The meeting. When two species collided around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, began migrating out of Africa. Some followed coastal routes into Asia. Others moved through the Middle East into Europe. And when they entered Europe, around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals, two species of human, both intelligent, both successful in their respective domains, suddenly sharing the same landscape. What happened next is one of the most studied and debated questions in paleoanthropology. For decades, the assumption was that modern humans simply replaced Neanderthals, outcompeting them for resources until the Neanderthal population collapsed. This replacement model suggested little or no interbreeding, that the two species remained separate until one went extinct. Then, in 2010, everything changed. The first Neanderthal genome was published, sequenced from DNA, extracted from fossils found in Vindija Cave in Croatia and other sites. When researchers compared this ancient genome to modern human DNA, they found something unexpected: matches. Stretches of Neanderthal DNA appeared in the genomes of modern humans, specifically in people whose ancestry traced outside of Africa. The evidence was unambiguous. Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred. The hybridization was limited, not extensive intermingling, but enough that genetic material passed from one species to the other. Today, individuals of European or Asian descent carry approximately 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. People of entirely sub-Saharan African ancestry carry little to none, except for small amounts introduced by back migration from Eurasia in more recent times. Recent studies, published in late 2024, have refined the timeline significantly. Analysis of over 300 ancient and modern human genomes, including 58 ancient genomes from early modern humans found across Eurasia, revealed that the major period of interbreeding occurred between about 50,500 and 43,500 years ago, centered around 47,000 years ago. This wasn't a brief encounter, but an extended period lasting roughly 7,000 years, representing multiple generations and potentially multiple encounters between different groups. The findings suggest there was one major, extended period of gene flow, rather than numerous separate interbreeding events scattered across time. Interestingly, the gene flow wasn't entirely one-directional. While most Neanderthal DNA in living humans comes from Neanderthals breeding with modern humans, some evidence suggests earlier gene flow went the other way. Around 250,000 years ago, during an earlier modern human or pre-modern human expansion out of Africa, some genetic material entered Neanderthal populations, contributing a small amount of modern human DNA to Neanderthal genomes. What did this interbreeding mean practically? Were these peaceful encounters? Violent? Somewhere in between? We can't know the nature of individual interactions. Hunter-gatherer groups meeting in the landscape could have responded in many ways. With violence, with cautious trade, with curiosity, with fear. Some encounters probably ended badly. Others might have led to temporary alliances, shared camps, even marriages or partnerships. What's clear is that hybrid children were born, and some of those children survived to adulthood and had children of their own. Their Neanderthal genes entered the modern human gene pool and persisted through thousands of generations to the present day. Not all Neanderthal genes survived equally. Some regions of the modern human genome are virtually devoid of Neanderthal DNA, suggesting those gene variants were harmful and removed by natural selection. Areas related to fertility, particularly genes on the X chromosome and genes expressed in testes, show very low Neanderthal ancestry. This suggests hybrid males may have suffered from reduced fertility, a common problem in hybrid animals, where two species have diverged enough that their genomes don't work perfectly together, but other Neanderthal genes were beneficial. Genes related to immune function, skin pigmentation, hair texture, and metabolism show higher frequencies of Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting these variants helped modern humans adapt to Eurasian environments. Neanderthals had been living outside Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd adapted to local diseases, climates, and conditions. When modern humans arrived, acquiring those pre-adapted genes through interbreeding gave them immediate advantages. For example, Neanderthal versions of immune system genes helped modern humans fight off viruses they encountered in Eurasia, particularly RNA viruses like ancient forms of influenza. These genes remain common in modern European populations, still protecting descendants from infections tens of thousands of years later. Neanderthal genes also influence traits like tendency to be a morning person, hair color and texture, skin tone, sensitivity to pain, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. Some Neanderthal gene variants are linked to increased risk for conditions like type 2 diabetes, while others are linked to protection against certain forms of disease. The total amount of Neanderthal DNA preserved across all modern humans is substantial. While individuals carry only 1 to 2%, different people carry different segments. When you add up all the unique Neanderthal DNA fragments scattered across humanity, approximately 20% of the Neanderthal genome has survived, not in any one person, but collectively across our species. We preserve a large fraction of what made Neanderthals genetically distinct. This has profound implications. Neanderthals didn't completely vanish. They were absorbed, integrated, assimilated into the modern human gene pool. Some researchers argue this genetic assimilation, combined with population pressures and environmental changes, contributed to their extinction as a distinct species. If young Neanderthals increasingly bred with modern humans rather than other Neanderthals, the population would have genetically dissolved over time. Extinction, the end of an ancient line. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record. The last dated sites are in southern Iberia, southern France, and a few other refugees. After that, nothing. No more Neanderthal fossils, no more Mousterian tools in layers younger than 40,000 years. A species that had endured for 400,000 years, that had survived multiple ice ages, that had spread across a continent, was gone. Why? The question has generated dozens of hypotheses, and the truth is probably that no single cause explains their extinction. Instead, multiple factors likely converged, creating conditions that Neanderthals couldn't survive. First, population size. Genetic evidence suggests Neanderthals always maintained relatively small populations, probably tens of thousands across their entire range. Modern human populations, by contrast, numbered in the hundreds of thousands or more. Small populations are inherently vulnerable. Random events, disease outbreaks, bad winters, or local disasters can cause disproportionate losses. A population numbering 100,000 can absorb losing 10,000 individuals. A population numbering 20,000 cannot. Second, climate change. The period around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago was marked by extreme climate instability, particularly Heinrich Event 4, a period of intense cold and rapid environmental shifts. These climate swings transformed landscapes, altered vegetation, and stressed animal populations. Neanderthals had survived climate changes before, but this time they faced additional pressures. Third, competition with modern humans. When Homo sapiens entered Europe, they brought more advanced technology, broader diets, and larger social networks. Modern humans made a wider variety of tools, including sophisticated hunting implements like atlatls and later bows. They exploited a broader range of food resources, including small game, fish, and birds. Resources Neanderthals largely ignored. They had more complex social structures that may have allowed larger group sizes and more extensive trade networks. This doesn't mean modern humans directly killed off Neanderthals through warfare, though some violent encounters probably occurred. Competition doesn't require violence. It simply means both species needed the same resources: caves for shelter, game animals for food, good quality stone for tools, and when those resources were limited, the species better equipped to exploit them had an advantage. Fourth, disease. When modern human populations expanded out of Africa, they likely carried pathogens that Neanderthals had never encountered. Lacking immunity, Neanderthal populations could have been devastated by diseases that were merely inconvenient for modern humans. One hypothesis suggests transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, prion diseases similar to mad cow disease, could have spread through Neanderthal populations practicing cannibalism, though evidence for this is speculative. Fifth, interbreeding and genetic assimilation. If Neanderthal populations were already small and fragmented, and if younger generations increasingly interbred with modern humans, the genetic distinctiveness of Neanderthals would have eroded. Over time, the population would have been absorbed rather than wiped out, leaving genetic traces but no distinct Neanderthal individuals. Sixth, inbreeding depression. Small populations forced into refuges during glacial periods would have faced increased inbreeding, mating between relatives. This concentrates harmful recessive genes and reduces genetic diversity, making populations more vulnerable to disease, environmental stress, and random demographic fluctuations. Mathematical models suggest that even without direct competition or environmental catastrophe, a small, fragmented population like the Neanderthals might have gone extinct through a combination of random events and demographic processes over 10,000 to 30,000 years. Add in climate change, competition, and potential disease, and extinction becomes not just possible, but likely. The last Neanderthals probably lived in isolated pockets, small bands clinging to familiar territories. Perhaps they knew they were the last, perhaps not. As their numbers dwindled, finding mates became harder. Knowledge was lost as elders died without passing it on. One by one, the bands would have vanished, until finally there were none left. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was attrition, slow and grinding, the kind of extinction that happens when everything goes slightly wrong all at once and there's no reserve capacity to recover. Legacy. What Neanderthals left behind. The Neanderthals are gone, but their legacy persists in ways both tangible and subtle. Physically, they survive in our genes. That 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA influences everything from immune function to hair texture. Some of us carry Neanderthal gene variants that affect how we respond to sunlight, to viruses, to pain. In a very real sense, Neanderthals are part of who we are, woven into our biology at the most fundamental level. Scientifically, they've transformed our understanding of human evolution. The old model of a linear progression from primitive to advanced, from ape-like ancestors to modern humans, has been replaced by a more complex picture. evolution is messy, contingent, full of extinct branches and surprising reconnections. Neanderthals showed us that human evolution wasn't a ladder, but a bush. Multiple species coexisting, sometimes interbreeding, competing and cooperating in ways we're still working to understand. Culturally, Neanderthals challenge us. They force us to confront what makes us human. If intelligence isn't unique to Homo sapiens, if symbolic thought, language, culture, and compassion existed in other human species, then being human is less about our specific species and more about capabilities we share with our extinct cousins. This is humbling and profound. Technologically, studying Neanderthals has driven innovations in DNA analysis, isotope geochemistry, microscopy, and computational modeling. The techniques developed to extract and sequence ancient DNA from Neanderthal fossils have been applied to other ancient samples, revolutionizing archaeology and paleontology. We can now sequence genomes from individuals who died tens of thousands of years ago, opening windows into the past that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Philosophically, Neanderthals raise questions about extinction, survival, and what it means to persist. They thrived for 400,000 years, far longer than modern humans have existed in our current form. Yet they're gone, and we remain. Was it inevitable? Could it have gone differently? If Neanderthals had been slightly more numerous, slightly more technologically advanced, or if climate had shifted differently, might modern humans be the extinct species? These aren't idle questions. In an age of climate change, habitat destruction, and species loss, the Neanderthal extinction reminds us that success is never permanent. Adaptation that works for hundreds of thousands of years can fail when conditions shift too quickly or pressures mount too high. The Neanderthals did everything right for their world, and that world changed. They couldn't adapt fast enough, and they vanished. But they also remind us of resilience. For hundreds of millennia, Neanderthals endured conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. They raised children in Ice Age winters. They hunted animals that could easily kill them. They survived injuries that should have been fatal. They adapted to climate swings that transformed entire landscapes. They were, in the truest sense, survivors. And perhaps that's the best way to remember them. Not as primitive cavemen or failed evolutionary experiments, but as humans, real and complex, who lived, loved, suffered, and persisted for longer than we've yet managed. They walked paths we'll never walk, saw landscapes that no longer exist, faced challenges we can barely imagine. They shaped tools with hands that look much like ours, thought thoughts with brains remarkably similar to our own, and left traces of themselves that we're still discovering, still decoding, still trying to understand. The Neanderthals are our kin, our cousins, our mirror held up across time. In studying them, we study ourselves, seeing both what makes us unique and what connects us to a deeper, older human story that stretches back through ice ages and beyond, into the deep past where all our lineages diverge from common ancestors we're only now beginning to glimpse. They lived, they left their mark, and now, as we sift through the bones and stones they left behind, as we sequence the DNA that survived buried in cave sediments, as we piece together their lives from fragments scattered across continents, we bring them back, not in flesh, but in memory, not as living beings, but as honored ancestors who walked this earth long before cities rose and civilizations formed. The Neanderthals taught us that being human isn't about being modern. It's about persisting, adapting, caring for each other, creating meaning from chaos, and leaving something behind that matters, even if only a few bones, a scattering of stone tools, and the faint genetic echoes in the DNA of children born thousands of generations later. Rest now, if you will, knowing that the past is not as distant as it seems. The Neanderthals live on in our genes, in our minds, in the questions they force us to ask about what we are and where we came from. Their story is our story, and their legacy, carved in stone and written in the language of DNA, will endure as long as humans remain curious about their origins. If you found meaning in this journey through deep time, if the Neanderthals and their world spoke to something in you, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And maybe, in the comments, share where you're listening from and what about the Neanderthals surprised you most. There's something quietly powerful about knowing others out there are falling asleep to the same ancient stories, the same questions about who we are and who we might have been. The lights are dim now. The glaciers have retreated. The mammoths are gone. But the story echoes still in caves and bones, in genes and memories, in the timeless human need to know where we came from and how we became who we are. Good night.